Hello, those of you who are on the line at this moment. My name is Elliot Roseman. We'll be getting started with the webinar in just a minute or two. We'll wait for folks to gather and get started right at 8 o'clock our time, 2 o'clock Central European time. So thank you for coming. We'll get started momentarily. Okay, well, I am showing just about 8 o'clock our time, maybe a minute before, but I'm going to get us started because we have a very substantive presentation and I want to leave the maximum amount of time available for that and for your questions and answers. So I'm going to call the meeting to order and get us started. My name is Elliot Roseman. I am the Program Director for the Electricity Market Initiative for Southeast Europe with the United States Energy Association. And we are delighted this morning here, this afternoon in Europe, or if you happen to be in Asia this evening, we're delighted to host this webinar on system flexibility and why it matters now more than ever, a case study of North Macedonia. And we have our two featured speakers, Stoyan Malczewski and Sime Kuzarewski from MEPSO, the transmission system operator of North Macedonia, joining us here. And they have, as I mentioned, a very substantive presentation. I will just make a couple of quick introductory remarks and then we'll be off and running. The United States Energy Association, as you may know, is a nonprofit, apolitical, and non-lobbying organization that was founded almost 100 years ago. And our overall mission, our overarching mission, is to promote the sustainable supply and use of energy for the greatest benefit of all. We do that in two primary ways, both of which we'll actually be exercising here this morning. One of which is to convene stakeholders to share policy and analytic and scientific and technical information to advance the energy sector. And we've certainly convened here this morning. The second way in which we do that is to promote energy development by expanding access to safe, affordable, sustainable, and environmentally acceptable energy in partnership with the US government. And USEA has been working in that regard for decades. We've been working with MEPSO, in particular in the Europe and Eurasia region and in other parts of the world, but we've been working in Europe and Eurasia and with MEPSO for over 30 years on a wide range of different analyses and transmission planning and decarbonization in a wide range of areas. So we're delighted today to provide a platform for our two speakers to present and discuss a key analysis that they've just completed. I'm going to let them define what flexibility means and how it is determined. Let me just quickly tee up what it does also involve. It involves dealing with a wide range of challenges, which in combination are unprecedented. We're dealing with the drive to decarbonize, with massive increases in renewables, with market integration and coupling issues, with uncertainty with regard to hydro and drought situations, with challenges to the, in many cases, antiquated coal generation fleet and coal supplies, with nuclear plant issues, particularly in Western Europe these days. And on top of all of that, of course, Russia's war in Ukraine and the challenges that that has posed with regard to fuel availability and the impact on fuel and power prices. So in this tumultuous, challenging situation, companies like MEPSO have to maintain system reliability and safety and ensure that customers get the power supplies that they need. And those challenges pose an opportunity as well. Flexibility is a critical part of that mission. And I'm going to let our guests elaborate from that point forward. So let me just mention that the presentation is about 45 minutes. If you have questions, which I hope you do, please put them in the chat box. We will, of course, get to as many as we can. We'll go over the hour if we have sufficient questions. We may carry over. For those whose questions we may not have a chance to get to, our guests, our speakers are going to answer those questions for you offline because we'll be able to keep track of who's asked the question. So feel free to put them into the chat. I will now turn to introducing our speakers, and we'll begin. Stoyan Malcheski is a power system planning engineer for the National Transmission System Operator of North Macedonia, or MEPSO, where he specializes in power systems and market modeling for system development, for system adequacy and connection studies. He's active in the development of ENSO-E system development structures and is currently working on a PhD in power system flexibility and its application in the planning process of power systems. So we will soon be calling you Dr. Malcheski. Sime Kucharevsky is also a planning engineer at MEPSO with a number of years of experience in power system modeling and analysis, as well as market modeling and simulation. He is currently working on national development studies and is part of the ENSO-E adequacy working groups while closely following the development of a national strategic framework. His particular areas of interest include energy system economics, market modeling, and power system reliability. And with that, Stoyan Malcheski, I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Elliot, for the kind words. And thank you all for attending. It's our honor to present our research in front of our colleagues from the energy sector. And we would like to express our gratitude for USEA for organizing the webinar and for the continuous support. So we came to the inspiration to do this work while studying the long-term plans of Europe and to us the implications that those plans hold for the future system operation. Before I continue with the presentation about our research, I would like to explain shortly about the changes Europe plans to implement in the energy and power sector, since that is important in the context of this presentation. So right now, Europe is reliant on fossil fuels to satisfy its energy needs. Our energy needs are increasing year by year, and the electricity is just a small part of the whole energy mix. Even lower are the renewable energy sources. So such an energy mix is not sustainable in the long run. And if we take into account global warming and the European pledges from the Paris Agreement into account, the power sector as one of the main contributors to greenhouse emissions will need to be reshaped in the years to come. Because of so, Europe has come up with a strategic framework for tackling the problem of power system reshaping and global warming, and its measures go along the following lines. So first, we plan in Europe to implement energy efficiency measures to reduce the total energy needs of our system. Then we further plan to electrify our society, where we plan to invest as much as possible in renewable energy sources. Also, we plan to decommission part of the existing thermal power plants and substitute them with greener solutions. So all of these changes will have significant impact on the power system operation in the future. And one area that's particularly important is the area of power system reliability. So future research is needed on this topic. But what's power system reliability? And well, to that question, there isn't a short answer. We can quickly define it as the ability of a power system to deliver the desired amount of energy within an accepted standard. So power system reliability covers from steady state and stability analysis by running some grid analysis software tools to system flexibility and balancing need studies run by market analysis. So there's a variety of softwares that are used, and when running this analysis, we almost always take into account the outage probability of system elements as well as the parameters of each element that might contribute to power system reliability. So traditionally, all of these analyses were of concern to operational departments, but since the planned changes in energy sector are so drastic, it's crucial to find ways to analyze them in the long run. So because of so, our focus was the target year 2030, by which year, at least to our knowledge, most notable changes on national and regional level will occur. So we focused on the analysis of power system flexibility and power system inertia, since these two fields are of particular importance in the long run in Europe. So what are power system flexibility and power system inertia? Well, power system flexibility is the ability of a power system to respond to changes in demand and supply. And power system inertia is the robustness of the system in response to a power plant or our system failures. So you may ask yourselves why we've researched these two topics. Well, first, because we plan to decommission the coal power plants in the region, and with that we expect the inertia region-wise to drop. And on the other hand, we plan to commission as much renewable energy sources as possible, which will increase the intermittency of the electricity production. So with this, it will be harder in the future to balance the system, since any imbalance caused by the renewables with the lower inertia to today's state of the system will be harder to compensate, to balance. So now that you know our reasoning behind it, before I continue explaining our research in detail, I'll explain to you the planning process in the energy sector in our country on a high level, so you will get a better grasp of where our research exactly fits. So in the energy system planning framework, the planning process starts with energy system planning. So the energy system planners use software such as Markal and Times, which as input requires statistical data on country level, as well as detailed data about the power and energy sector. They use this data to run calculations from which they draft energy strategy documents. In this stage of research and in this stage of planning, they don't consider the system flexibility and system inertia, since those are out of the scope of their research. Then in the energy system planning framework, we have the power system planning framework, in which we as power system planners must conduct planning exercises on system level. So to do so, we run market-based simulations in tools such as the market simulator Antares, which as an input requires detailed data on hourly level about the power sector on national and regional level. So here the EMI models are of great help to us because they speed the modeling process greatly by providing us with ready-made regional model and time series. As an output of the process, we have system adequacy and flexibility studies. So in parallel to this process, we plan the system by analyzing the transmission network for future scenarios. For this, we use software such as PSSC, which is a grid simulator software, and there as input we have the regional model, as from the EMI or from SECI. Those are two frameworks which provide regional models for Southeast Europe, and we combine that with the outputs from the energy strategy as well. Then in order to make the balance for the required tower for some specific analysis, we use the Antares output, and then we create models. As an output of this process, we draft detailed reports about the future states of the power transmission system. So in our research, we are using the Antares outputs to compute flexibility metrics, from which we draw conclusions about the flexibility and inertia for future scenarios. These conclusions can be used as guidelines for the energy system planners to account in their analysis properly the system flexibility and inertia when they'll make changes to the national strategic documents in the future. So this wraps it up about where research fits. And our research isn't the only one that's currently published in Europe. There are others. So it's not a popular topic right now, but it's getting some friction. Please remember that the list that I will talk about is a non-exhaustive reference list, and you can search on your own to find more interesting studies. We would recommend one of the best studies done in Europe to read first. That's the adequacy study from the Belgian system operator. This is state-of-the-art, one of the best treatises on this topic. There are two interesting studies from the energy community. Their study on system adequacy as well as system flexibility. And finally, for those beginning with this field, we would recommend reading the study from IRENA on system flexibility as a must-read for anyone wishing to start researching this field. So there are two notable research centers worth mentioning: the National Renewable Energy Laboratory from USA, as well as the Joint Research Center from the European Union. These two centers research hot topics most of the time, even before the TSOs realize those are the hot topics. So since there are a lot of scientific papers, we won't cover everything, but in the interest of time, we are giving you with a few keywords that you can use to do some research on your own. Right, so the rest of the presentation is organized in the following manner. First, my colleague Sima will explain more about scenarios, data, and models. And then I'll explain to you more about the research methodology, and we'll continue with the explanation of the study results, the key messages drawn from our research, as well as the future plans for research of this field in MEPSO. Finally, the references that we were previously talking about are on a slide, and because the presentation will be distributed, you can search those documents through the links. With this, I would like to give the floor to Sima to present to you in more details the scenarios, data, and models used in our research. Sima, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stoyan. This part of the research is quite important since we are using quality data sets such as the EMI one and combining with our expert knowledge about the national strategic framework makes it possible to draft meaningful future scenarios for any analysis. In our research, we have used multiple data sets such as the EMI and Pan-European Climate Database. The data sets generated by the NCOE tool Trapunta and the data from the Macedonian Energy Strategy Framework. The EMI data sets has data on generator level for the hydro and thermal power plants, data about the hydrology of storage and run-of-river hydropower plants, the NTC capacities of interconnection links between countries, as well as hourly data for load and capacities for wind and solar. The Pan-European Climate Database contains weather parameters for 35 weather patterns, which we processed by custom scripts to generate 35 capacity factors for wind and solar on hourly resolution. The demand time series are also with hourly granularity for the 35 climatic years for each country based on the outputs of the NCO tool Trapunta. And finally, we are using our database at MEPSO and our expert knowledge about the national strategic framework to further modify the national market model to the needs of this analysis. First, I will talk more about the Southeast Europe region before continuing with the details on the national level. In the years to come, in the region, we expect the decommissioning of the most of the coal and heavy oil power plants. The regional plan is to substitute the decommissioned TPP's capacity with gas-fired thermal power plants. On the other side, in the years to come, the rest capacity will follow a steep commissioning trend, increasing by roughly 360%. Using the available data, we created the market models by modeling the hydropower plants in their inflows, the wind and solar using the 35 climatic years from the Pan-European Climate Database. Next, using the Trapunta datasets, we model the load in the region using 35 different time series. The thermal and hydropower plants are modeled on a plant-by-plant basis using the EMI dataset, and each thermal power plant follows 20 unique outage patterns. Finally, each country is connected with its neighbors by NTC-based interfaces provided in the EMI dataset. From the national energy strategy, we can conclude that the thermal power plants on coal and heavy oil will get decommissioned. At the same time, the plan envisions a slight increase in gas-fired thermal power plants. Up to 2030, the focus will be on commissioning renewables, and our country has ambition plan to commissioning new hydropower plants in that period. Our national energy strategy envision a fast-paced decommissioning of lignite-based TPPs. In 2020, the plan was to decommission our oldest lignite power plant, Oslomed, with an installed capacity of 120 megawatts. And during the same year, the plan was to decommission the oil power plant Negotino with an installed capacity of 210 megawatts. Today, these power plants are still operational, but without retrofitting, these TPPs are on the end of their lifetime. In 2025, we plan to decommission the largest lignite-based complex in our country, thermal power plant Bitola, with an installed capacity of around 640 megawatts. And during the same year, according to the energy strategy, we plan to install 141 megawatt of TPP on gas. Finally, by 2030, we plan to commission a pump storage facility with 333 megawatts of turbine capacity and additional 192 megawatts of hydropower plants in the Vardar River basin. After the National Energy Strategy was published, the relevant institution published two key documents, the National Energy and Climate Plan and the Plan for the Realization of the Energy Strategy, which covers the period up to 2030. These two documents further fortify the Macedonian position for decommissioning the lignite and oil power plants. Additionally, the plan for the commissioning of new gas power plant changed. Instead of previously mentioned investment of 141 megawatts in gas TPP, the plan is to install 450 megawatts instead. The plan until 2030 is uncertain, and even though the planning framework has envisioned that we will invest in large hydropower plants. Those plans weren't set in motion so far, at least to our knowledge. Because of so, when creating the scenarios, we took into account only PSP Chevron project for which the tender procedure has already started. Speaking about the renewables, especially for wind and solar power plants, there is no change in accompanying planning documents such as the National Energy and Climate Plan regarding National Energy Strategy. But in practice, MEPSO is swamped with connection for request for renewables. Based on this available data, when drafting the scenario, we create two RES development scenarios. one based on the National Energy Strategy Framework, and the other based on the interest in investment in renewable energy in our country. When modeling in Antares, we modeled through RES development scenarios, low res and high res. The low res scenario closely follows the National Energy Strategy Framework, where the installed solar capacity is around 560 megawatts, and installed wind capacity is around 440 megawatts. The high-res scenario reflects the interest for investment in renewables from a few months back, where the installed solar capacity is 2,000 megawatts and installed wind capacity is 1,100 megawatts. We paired these two RES development scenarios with three different development scenarios for conventional generation sources: base case, additional thermal power plant, and pump storage hydropower plant Chevron. From these three development scenarios of the conventional generation sources, the base case scenario doesn't take into account any development of the conventional generation sources. The scenario with additional thermal power plant take into account 450 megawatts of new gas-fired power plants. And the last one takes into account the PSP Chevron project with its capacity of 333 megawatts. All in all, the combination of three development scenarios for the thermal power plants and two RES development scenarios give a total of 6 national scenarios that we modeled in Antares. Low res with combination with base case, with additional TPP and with PSP Chevron, and high res in combination with base case, with additional TPP and with PSP Chevron. On this slide, on the table, the data shows the flexibility parameters of all hydro and thermal power plants in the Macedonian power system. From the data in the table, we can see that when we analyze system flexibility with an hourly resolution, each hydrothermal power plant can be brought online, even if it wasn't dispatched by Antares. But thermal power plant TETO can't be brought online if it wasn't dispatched in Antares in an hours. On the right-hand side table, you have the fuel type prices and the CO2 price used in this study. These prices are the same as the one used in the decarbonization study for the Southeast Europe region from the EMI project under the USEA. So this wraps it up, and now I will give floor to Stoyan to explain you the research methodology that we used.
Thank you, Simon. Great. So I'll continue with the research methodology. So this research methodology was supposed to serve as a high-level methodology for the assessment of the flexibility. Sorry, guys. So this methodology was meant to serve as a high-level method for the assessment of the flexibility needs of a power system. It was important to us that the metrics are peer-reviewed by the industry and academia so that we know what we are using. Also, one of the strong sides is that this methodology is stochastic in its nature by using the Antares software, so we take into account the variability of the renewable energy sources as well as the outages of the thermal power plants. To make possible to repeat these calculations, because this is not something that you've done you do only once, it's an exercise that you'll have to repeat. We've automated the calculation procedure in the programming language R, and when we were doing so, we were looking forward to do it in such a way that we can repeat this exercise for any region anywhere in the world. So finally, one important aspect about our research methodology is that it can be run on commercial computer without any problems. I'll continue with giving a high-level overview of our methodology before I continue to talk in details about the different metrics. So at the core, we have the data sets, such as the one from the Energy Market Initiative, the Pan-European Climate Database, and the one that we have, our in-house MEPSO data set. So we use custom functions in the software tool Trapunta to create system data about demand, solar, wind, as well as a thermal power plant with their outages and the hydropower plants. So we use this system data to create Antares models as an input the time series analysis scripts and tools that we've developed. So in combination with the flexibility parameters and through all of these tools, we are able to generate metrics as a result. And by looking to these metrics, we can draw conclusions about the system flexibility and inertia of the analyzed power system. For our research, we've analyzed 6 Antares models, as Tim has said, by combining the regional EMI model and by modeling case-specific national scenarios. So we run each model for 700 Monte Carlo years, which is achieved by simulating a combination of 35 climatic years in combination with 20 outage patterns of the thermal power plants, which will result in high rest variability in the end. So this is quite complex to do, and to cut down at least on modeling time, we've automated the model creation process in tools such as RStudio and Python. And finally, the hallmark of our research is that we've developed a framework for automatic result processing, because on average, we have 60 million outputs that we need to process for every singular calculation, and that requires a lot of time. And you have to take into account that we need around a full day to run the market simulator. So now that you're familiar with our methodology, at least on a high level, I'll continue explaining the flexibility metrics in more detail. So first, we have the renewable penetration index. This index is calculated at the sum of the hourly wind and solar production divided by the hourly system load. So we run this calculation for each of the 8,760 hours of each of the 35 climatic years in the Pan-European Climate Database. So finally, this metric is equal to the maximal value out of all calculated values. The positive side is that this metric is easy to compute. It has a straightforward interpretation, but at the same time, it's computed in a deterministic manner, and its quality is dependent on the quality of the input set. The next metric is the renewable energy penetration index, and this metric is calculated as the annual sum of the wind and solar production divided by the annual sum of the system load. So this metric is calculated for 35 climatic years, and the final value, or the value presented, is the mean value out of all calculated values. So also this metric is easy to compute, and it's quite a good one because with it you can get a rough estimation about the future rest production. But the negative sides are same as the previous metric, and that's that it's computed in a deterministic manner, and then the quality of the results is determined by the quality of the input data. Before continuing the explanation of the remaining metrics, I'll explain the concept of net load and net load ramp. So net load, by definition, is the load that has to be served by dispatchable technologies such as thermal power plants, hydropower plants, storage units, and others. So in our case, the net load is computed as the difference between the system load and the renewable energy sources production and the must-run generation from the Antares tool on hourly level. With this, we can calculate the net load ramp, which is also one extremely important metric. And the net load ramp is calculated as the difference between the net loads of 2 consecutive hours. So knowing this, we'll continue with the metrics. The next one is the loss of renewable energy estimation. So this metric is calculated as the total probability of 3 specific periods deemed important for the function of all power systems. So first, it takes into account the period during which the net load of the system will be below 0. The second period takes into account the probability that the positive or the upward net load ramp is greater or equal than the ramp up capability of the system. And finally, the third period considers the probability that the negative or downward net load ramp is greater or equal than the ramp down capability of the system. So this metric is computed post ante using the Antares output as data basis. The metric gives a clear indication of the potential problems with system ramping capabilities. And when calculating the metric, only the contribution from the available or the dispatch generation by Antares is taken into account. The negative side is that it processes a lot of information and it is impossible to do it by hand. So you must write a custom code in order to calculate this metric. The final metric is the non-synchronous penetration ratio, which is used to estimate system inertia. This metric is calculated as the hourly production of wind and solar plus the import through HVDC cables, and all of this is divided by the hourly system load and the export for that hour. When you calculate this metric for each hour of each Monte Carlo year, you can then devise the histogram and analyze the statistical data to get a grasp about the system inertia of our system. The upside is that this metric is also computed post ante using the Antares output as its basis, and then it gives a rough estimate of the system inertia through a relatively simple calculation. The downsides are that it's also infeasible to calculate by hand, at least if you run 700 Monte Carlo years, which you're supposed to. And this metric doesn't take into account the neighboring power system directly into the calculation. So with this, we'll wrap things up about the methodology. And on the next slides, I'll continue with the obtained results. So the study result chapter can be summarized as follows, right? First, we have the regional flexibility outlooks for Southeast Europe. Small presentation about that. Then we'll turn our attention to the detailed results on national level. And we will end up with some detailed results for selected neighboring countries, just to see how the region stands. So first, we will talk about the region. And here we have the results for renewable penetration index on the left-hand side, and for the renewable energy penetration index on the right-hand side. For these two parameters, the value of one means that the total hourly or the total annual production of renewable energy sources is equal to the hourly of yearly system load. So these parameters are calculated in a deterministic manner using the 35 climatic years from the Pan-European climate database. The results in some countries such as Montenegro, Kosovo, Serbia, or Bulgaria have high renewable penetration index but low renewable energy penetration index. So in these countries that have low renewable energy penetration index and high renewable penetration index, it might be the case that the strategic framework for that country is in a need of rework, or that the country hasn't provided us with the data for the interest in investment in renewables. Since most of the countries have high renewable penetration index and low renewable energy penetration index, to us, that's a clear indicator that one of the interesting things in the future will be studies in power to X and X to power technologies. They might prove feasible in this case. These technologies are hydrogen storages or electrolyzers, electric vehicles, etc. Right. Now I'll shift my attention on national level. And we have the statistical data for the renewable penetration index in the table, while the histogram shows the distribution for the low rest scenarios. So both low and high risk scenarios have similar distributions. That's the reason why we only presented the histogram for a low risk scenario. So it's so from the histogram, we can conclude and from the table that all the values are centered around the mean. And from the histogram, we can conclude, apologies, this is a mistake, that the data is centered around the mean, more on the minimal value. Right, so because we have high renewable penetration index in our country, especially for a high risk scenario, we would like to research in the future power to X and X to power technologies, because we concluded that one of the reasons for this is the low system load that we have in our country. Next are the results for the renewable energy penetration index. We have the results for the 2 rest scenarios in the table, and we have the histogram for the low rest scenarios. So first and foremost, it's the same case as with the renewable penetration index. The histograms or the distributions are similar. So only the low rest distribution is presented. Here, there isn't much difference between the minimal, maximal, and mini value. So the time series shows stable production with some variation, and the data is skewed to the left, meaning that most of the data is centered around the mean, which is closer to the maximal value. As expected with high rest integration, we'll have high renewable energy penetration index. And this is expected, but at the same time, because there is a high ratio between the renewable energy penetration index and renewable penetration index, that will lead to hours during which we'll have most of the production from renewables, which might cause problems with the system inertia and the system overall. Next, we have the results for the loss of renewable estimation. So here, the first 3 rows of the table show the results for the low rest scenarios, while the last 3 rows contain the results for a high rest scenario. The numbers in the table are in percent, and we have the results for all 3 periods, as well for the loss of renewable estimation metric. Just as reminder, period 1 shows the probability for rest curtailment due to the net load being below 0. Period 2 shows the probability that the upward or positive net load ramp is higher or equal than the ramp up capability of the system. And period 3 shows the probability that the negative or downward net load ramp is higher or equal than the ramp up capability of the system based on the Antares outputs. Right, so for both low and high rest scenarios, period 2 significantly contributes to the probability of rest curtailment due to the limited ramp up capability of the Macedonian power system. The commissioning of new thermal power plants or the pump storage project Chevron will be crucial in reducing this probability. For both low and high rest scenarios, period 3 proves to be negligible, or the ramp down capability of the system is adequate, at least to this calculation with the numbers that we've modeled, because right now we have even greater interest from the power sector for investments in renewables. Finally, period 1 is negligible for low rest scenarios, but for the high rest, it's the main contributor to the metric. That's why, if not on regional basis, we on national basis in the years to come will analyze different technologies to see how it stands, because we plan to give ideas how to implement it in parallel with the rest integration process. On the other hand, we also have the system inertia. which is calculated from the non-synchronous penetration ratio for all of the 6 analyzed scenarios in Antares. Here, a value of 1 means that during that hour, when the value is 1, all of the export and the load of the system of that country was covered by production connected to inverters such as wind, solar, HVDC cables, right, etc. From the results, we can see that the skewness will change from right to left as we increase the renewable energy sources. And with that, the system inertia in our country will decrease. From the figures about high-rest scenarios, we can conclude that in North Macedonia, as the capacity from renewable energy sources increases, our system will be more and more dependent on its neighbors for providing us with inertia. Also, we can conclude that the higher values of the non-synchronous penetration ratio are mostly due to the higher rest values being analyzed. And if we increase this further, we'll have even worse state of our system. To mitigate these effects, at least on national level, it's important to analyze measures for increasing system inertia through synthetic provision of system inertia through the renewable energy sources. So this concludes the results on a national level. Next, we thought that it would be interesting to show the results for some of the countries of the South in Southeast Europe, because to us at least they were interesting. We chose Bulgaria and Montenegro, since Bulgaria is the third largest producer and Montenegro is a relatively small power system. For both of these power systems, even though we wanted to calculate the loss of renewable curtailment or estimation metric, we didn't have the data and we were on about the generators on plane by plate basis, so we were unable to do so. Right, so for Bulgaria, we have the results in the table for the renewable penetration index and renewable energy penetration index, and the histogram for the non-synchronous penetration ratio at the bottom. The histogram shows that the non-synchronous ratio is skewed to the right, meaning that most of the values are closer to 0 in this case, which is expected since Bulgaria operates one of the largest conventional power plant mixes in Southeast Europe. From the table, we can conclude that both metrics are centered around the mean value, but we can also conclude that the renewable penetration energy penetration index is quite low, which is unusual for such large power system. In our words, we can conclude that Bulgaria, as one large power system, has reasonable renewable penetration and renewable energy penetration index, while they maintain their system inertia just fine. On the other hand, we have the results for Montenegro. Here we also in the table, we have the data for the renewable penetration index and renewable energy penetration index, and below we have the histogram for the non-synchronous penetration ratio. From the histogram, we can conclude that we have a data skewed to the left or centered data. But what's important is that most of the values are between 1 and 3, which proves that their system inertia might be jeopardized in the future. Or you can say that they'll have to rely on the neighboring power system to keep their frequency in check. The renewable and the renewable energy penetration ratios are centered around the mean, and from the results in the table, we can conclude that even Montenegro has low energy renewable energy penetration index, which is also quite strange. But the overall conclusion is that for this system, further analysis is required, at least about the system inertia. So with this slide, we'll conclude the presentation on the results. And from the calculations done so far, we came to conclusions from which we formed 5 key messages, which summarize our findings. So the first key message is that is regional, and our research shows that even with low renewable energy sources value modeled in Antares, there are countries with low system inertia, and potentially this may lead to regional stability problems in the future. The second key message is again about system inertia, and our findings show that with the decommissioning of TPPs and ambitious renewable energy sources integration targets, system inertia on a national level will decrease, and because of so, measures for synthetic inertia provisions should be investigated. Next, from the results, we've concluded that further research on Power-to-X and next-to-power technologies integration is needed, at least on national level, because of the high ratios between the renewable and renewable energy penetration index, as well as the results for the loss of renewable energy estimation metric. The analysis of the loss of the renewable energy metric shows that both projects, the pump storage Chevron and thermal power plants on gas, around 450 megawatts, impact the ramp-up capability of our system positively, which capability deteriorates with the integration of high-res capacities. And finally, these metrics can be used as early warning signals in the national dispatch centers in the future with adequate adaptations. We don't plan to stop here. We'll also plan to continue the research in this field by advancing the current methodology that we presented. So instead of only skimming through the needs and analyzing them, we want to include the means, and we want to give directions in which means our country should invest based on our flexibility needs. We would also like to make dedicated study about Power-to-X and X2-power for the Macedonian power system and possibly for the region. To analyze the system inertia, we plan to use the Rokov methodology. You can check this methodology through NSOE published work. It's quite interesting one. And we want to check system inertia on the regional and national level in the mid and long term. Aside from that, we also plan to analyze the grid flexibility of our system, running automatic calculations for each of the hours of all climatic years in PSSE or in the grid analyzer. So we have for this a Python script to create regional models automatically, but this is still work in progress. In the years to come, we plan to integrate a similar flexibility analysis, such as the one implemented by ELIA, and we plan to include adequacy and flexibility at the same time. And finally, we plan to further experiment with different flexibility metrics and work on new ones to come to better understanding of this field, since it is a new one. Right, with this, I hope we weren't boring. I would like to conclude this presentation. The research was fun and we are eager to repeat it anytime, anywhere. So Elliot, I give the floor to you and we would like to hear the audience questions.
Very good, thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. Very interesting presentation. I have several questions myself, but we want to get to those that our audience, that our participants have posed. So let me start off with one that has come in on the chat from Jonathan Sager. And Jonathan's question is, what is the role of the bulk electric supply system, BESS as he calls it, in your energy strategy? Could the introduction of a bulk energy system a BESS mitigate the need for imports to deal with system inertia? Actually, BESS in this case may refer to energy storage. As I think of it now, there's two different acronyms there. So could you talk about the role of storage in your energy strategy?
Our energy strategy, aside from the pump storage plant Chevron, which should be commissioned in 2029, didn't include any batteries or demand side management or any technology of that kind. To our knowledge, that was only done in Greece so far. So they are the front runners in that field. If I remember correctly, they plan to implement around 1,000 megawatts in 2025. To my knowledge about the Southeast European sector, everyone will implement some batteries because the investors show interest in this technology. So the technology is recognized, but it's not part of the strategic framework.
Okay, but it sounds like you would expect, as Jonathan implies with his question, that storage could be one of the part of the solution to the low system inertia issues that you mentioned.
Yes, just to clarify, we didn't talk more about batteries because our research was on hourly basis. But if we turn down from 50-minute basis or 1-minute basis, it will show that this region is in need of such technologies because we are lacking in this department.
Got it. So an opportunity for future research. Let me ask you, how explicitly do you take imports and their availability into account? You indicated that low system inertia might necessitate the need for greater imports, and given the NTC values, the national transfer capabilities, transmission capabilities, how do you explicitly incorporate those in looking at what the reliability or inertia needs might be?
Right. So right now, that's incorporated in the non-synchronous penetration ratio. I'll just quickly open that slide. So it's important on the top side. We take this into account as the imports for HVDC cables, non-present in our system, but present in Montenegro. One of the reasons about the bad histogram results, and we take the exports in the, forgot what this part of the equation was called, never mind. They are not taken in the metrics, but on Antares as a market simulator, which has each country interconnected with each one through NTC-based interfaces, takes into account the interconnections, their capacity, and their contribution that they'll have for the system and in these metrics. But what's interesting is that we're talking about renewables. The values of renewables were quite low for most countries in Southeast Europe, and if they have high values of renewables installed, we will see correlation between hours in which we will need to import energy for flexibility, at least, and during those hours we will need the interconnection for export. So those will be two contradictory timeframes. One time frame in which we'll have two contradictions. We will need the NTCs for export, and they will be at the same time needed for flexibility provisions from neighboring power systems.
Very interesting, thank you. We have another question that Gazman Kabashi just posted, which has to do with reserve requirements. And how do you take reserves that are provided by wind and solar into account? Obviously, wind and solar are intermittent resources, but to what extent do you give or do you model reserve contributions from renewables?
Those aren't accounted in this study.
They are not accounted in this study.
Now, if we talk about inertia, they're definitely not. If we talk about flexibility, and it's the implications of the reserves on the model, we've modeled the reserves through the European database from MEPSO by adding the megawatts needed for reserves to the load for each hour. But this research doesn't treat the balancing needs of the system, even though as transmission system operator, we will have to do a probabilistic estimation of the balancing needs in the future.
Sure.
Just check if I answered the question.
Well, we'll let Guzman weigh in again if he wants to pursue that further. But as you've pointed out, rising renewables, particularly wind and solar, will lead to new balancing requirements, in some cases significant balancing requirements. And we've done some other research at USEA, also in Southeast Europe, looking at the significant increase in the benefits of what are called common dimensioning and the platforms in which one can trade balancing energy and reserves. So it's an important area, clearly. Let me follow up and ask you how, given the drive to decarbonize, and you mentioned what is going to be taking place with the thermal power plants, the TPPs in North Macedonia. How are you taking that sort of both decarbonization in the region and the carbon tax, the CBAM, the cross-border carbon border adjustment mechanism, excuse me, CBAM, and those sorts of things into account? Do they factor into this analysis, or is that sort of another area at MEPSO?
We didn't account the cross-border carbon tax methodology. It was quite new when we were starting modeling, running the simulations. It was just starting then, but we have included in the price of each thermal power plant, and the thermal power plants are the ones that form the marginal price in Antares. We formed the price taking into account the CO2 price for that region. For that, we used the recent EMI work, the decarbonization study that Sime suggested reading. So there we run the analysis, and we came to conclusion that around 66 euros per gigajoule. Then you have to convert this in order to get the price, but nonetheless, is the price of CO2. So those are the accounts about CO2 price, the ATS mechanism. Also in the market model, one of the main assumptions was full market coupling, or that all of the NTCs are fully available for import and export, and at the same time we took into account that the ATS system is implemented in each country.
Okay, there's a question that just also came in. I'm just going to read it. This was from Ilir Shala, Mr. Shala. And you may be able to see it there, but what it says, what Mr. Shala asks is, with the saturation of CBC, based on res connections and applications in the MEPSO grid, what do you plan to do with the interconnected grid, since the region has many requests for connection to the res network beyond those planned with the energy strategies of the Western Balkan countries? Are you able to speak to sort of the res integration process and the challenges of queue management and any of those issues that Mr. Shala suggests here?
Just one quick question. What's CBC?
I was wondering that myself. So maybe Mr. Shala, if you could just define CBC for us, will be. But while we're waiting for that, okay, cross-border capacity. There we go. Cross-border
capacity.
So yeah. So how do you take the availability of renewables, say, into account in other countries, as well as the queues and the process? You've looked at low res and high res at different penetration levels.
Yes.
Is this a process where you can actually integrate what's happening elsewhere, as well as the queue in North Macedonia?
Yes. So when we were creating the market model, This model took into account the whole Southeast Europe region. We've used the EMI data from the last analysis, where we've modeled the renewables in each country specifically, with 35 climatic years taking into account 8,760 hours, and the capacity that each TSO provided to the EMI group. So that's how we took the renewable energy sources into account. But not only that, all of the technologies, thermal power plants, hydropower plants, those are on modeled plant-by-plant basis. We have the load for 8,760 hours. And all of those are connected to the NTCs. And we have one regional model by doing so, and we run the simulation there. So the effects from the neighbors are took into account by default by running the Antares market model.
Got it. Okay.
That's what was the first part of the question. I don't have a chat in front of me.
I think you addressed it. I think you addressed it. Another question here from Gazman Kabashi. How does, and I'll expand, I'll read the question, but I'll expand on it as well. The question that he asks is based on the PSSE simulations by MEPSO under high res penetration, is there a need for additional 400 kV interconnection lines between North Macedonia and other TSOs, considering that the 400 kV line to Albania is finished? I'll expand on that to ask you how the research you're doing feeds into the planning at MEPSO for the upgrades that may be needed to transmission more broadly.
Right, so slightly out of the scope of the presentation, but
sure.
To answer that, we are currently running a development study for our country. So there we will run detailed PSSE models with Europe in their scope, and then we will translate those results from Antares to PSSE. Just quickly change the slide so maybe that will be clearer for the other participants. Guzman knows this. So we'll transpose the results to PSSE for certain regimes, and then we will come to detailed network conclusions. Now, as of now, we don't know which border might need further strengthening. But as each TSO knows, we have astronomical numbers in RES connection needs. So it might prove in the future that we will need an investment in or strengthening of some existing interconnections. To read on this, if you want to get into more details, you can use the ENSOE system identification needs, which is part of the TUNDP, and if I'm not mistaken, the results were recently published. But I might be mistaken since I don't follow that process quite closely as I would want to.
Right, it's a fascinating question to think about. What is the level of self-reliance that a country wants to have going forward, given how well already interconnected Southeast Europe is and the potential for greater interconnection? Should a country try to develop renewable projects internally, or to what extent could it rely or lean on others, to satisfy its reliability and inertia and balancing needs?
Yeah,
it's a policy-related question. I know that you didn't study here, but it's an interesting topic.
That's the future, actually, because none of these systems, even the large ones, such as from Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, they won't be able to balance themselves internally. What's important is to couple the markets in this region and to couple the markets in Europe. That's one of the first thing to do, but that won't solve anything on its own. It's important to participate in frameworks such as Picasso and Mari, where you can trade for secondary and tertiary reserves with the countries that participate. So to me, none of the systems here and none of the Western power system is able to balance themselves as an isolated system.
That's an excellent point. I'm glad you raised that here. The ability to self-supply is not there particularly at significant levels of renewables, but even at more modest levels in a number of cases. So the importance of sort of regional platforms, like you mentioned, Picasso, Mare, Terre, and others are vital in not only providing for the primary, secondary, tertiary reserves, but also in minimizing the cost of meeting those balancing energy and reserve needs.
Yes, but also at the same time, everyone should have in mind that even that's true, you must also have some sources for balancing in-house in your country. Because if you rely too much on your neighbors for balancing, then you will reduce the NTC on all borders because you must save that capacity. So you can transfer that power as needed at any time. So that will reduce the NTC of each country if we all rely on our neighbors for balancing. I think that wraps it up on that topic.
Very good, very good. I don't see any other questions in the chat. If other questions occur to our participants here after we conclude this webinar, feel free to send them in, to me or to our speakers, and I'm sure they will be delighted to address them. With that, I want to thank our speakers, Stoyan Malczewski, Simi Kuzarewski from MEPSO. I want to thank everybody who's participated here today. We'll be continuing with webinars as topics arise, and we welcome your participation as always. So thank you for coming here this morning or this afternoon, wherever you are, and we are adjourned. Thanks.